सिन्दूरारुणविग्रहां त्रिनयनां माणिक्यमौलिस्फुरत् तारानायकशेखरां स्मितमुखीमां मीनवक्षोरुहाम् पाणिभ्यामलिपूर्णरत्नचषकं रक्तोत्पलं बिभ्रतीं सौम्यां रत्नघटस्थरक्तचरणां ध्यायेत् परामम्बिकाम् सान्निपातिकज्वर सततज्वर विषमज्वर ग्रह नक्षत्र दोषाञ्चान्या हर हर काली सर सर गौरी गम गम विद्ये आले माले काले बन्धे भज भज विद्ये मख मख विद्ये नाशय नाशय पापम् हर हर दुःस्वप्नम् विध्वंसय विध्वंसय विघ्नविनाशिनि रजनी सन्ध्ये मुन्दुभिनादे मानस्तोषे मानसवेगे शङ्खिनी चक्रिणी वज्रिणी गदिनी शूलिनी अपमृत्युविनाशिनी विश्वेश्वरी द्राविडी केशवदैते पशुपति सहिते भीममर्दिनि गमनी कामिनी शबरी किराती वाचक्री ॐ द्रं 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 ॐ द्रं गुरु गुरु
नमस्ते सभाये नमः सभासद्भ्यो नमः. A warm greetings to all of you who have joined us this evening. Today we are in the second day of the festival. This is a month-long festival, global festival of yoga that has commenced yesterday and goes on up to 20th of July, having 3 sessions a day, and we will be featuring excellent speakers, experts from diverse backgrounds. I would like to take this opportunity to welcome you all for this session, and we are very fortunate to have with us Shri Shraddhalu Ranade ji today. Namaste Shraddhalu da.
Namaste. Happy to be with all of you.
Thank you. Shraddhalu ji is a multifaceted personality. He is a scholar, a scientist, educator, and a speaker par excellence. First time when I heard him about 2 decades back, I carried the spell for nearly 2 days with me, and it continues to be so even now. He was very fortunate to grow up in Sri Aurobindo Ashram, Pondicherry, from a very young age of 6 months, has been blessed by Sri Aurobindo, the mother, and Sri MP Panditji, under whose guidance he grew up. And this is what he carries. He carries that light and travels across the globe, mentoring many seekers, seekers from diverse backgrounds, seekers from the spiritual community, yoga community, business community, and various groups which are working on conscious models. So he's a guide and a mentor to many such groups across the world. The beauty about Sri Shraddhalu Das teaching is that his ability to seamlessly integrate modern scientific knowledge with philosophical, metaphysical, and spiritual knowledge. So we are about to hear him, and I'm sure you will experience and appreciate this. And additionally, he's also been an educator, a teacher educator. His workshops on integral education has benefited thousands of teachers across the globe. So this is our fortunate that we are having him again for the second time. He was there with us at the inauguration, and again today, this evening, he is with us. Shraddhaluda, very much. Thank you very much for accepting to be here.
Thank you.
Before I hand over the stage to Shraddhaluda, I would request all the participants to make the most of this session. If you have any questions, please note it down in the question answer box that is there. At the end of the session, after 15 minutes, we will open it up for question and answers, and then we'll conclude it. So all the best, and thank you very much.
Namaste. The theme that we have set for this session is integral well-being through yoga. And the theme of well-being itself is very diverse. If you ask 10 different people, what does well-being mean to you? You'll get 10 different answers. And for the simple reason that well-being is of many kinds. And all those answers would be right, but they would be specific to their needs in that phase of their life. Not only well-being is of many kinds, it is also on many levels, in many parts of our being. Well-being is not just one being, it is a different part of our being each time. In fact, somebody will say that I feel well when I am free of illness. Someone will say, I feel well when I'm energetic from morning to evening and I can do everything that I want to do. I have the life force to do it. Someone else will say, I feel well when my mind is clear and I can think and I can act effectively. Someone else might say, I feel well when I feel connected with everybody and I'm with friends and I'm happy. And all of these are right, but they are in different layers of our consciousness. And all of these we would want ideally to be present simultaneously. It's not enough if you feel happy, but your health is bad. It's not enough if your health is good, but you're unhappy. So that's where the concept of an integral well-being comes. And integral is not the same as holistic. Holistic would be a good word. It would mean that all of us, all the parts in us are feeling well. But integral has a different connotation than holistic. It takes the whole, but it integrates around the center. Why is this important? Because when you say, I feel well, in one part, I'm happy, let's say, and I feel well in another part, my health is good, the two can often be in contradiction. When my health is good, then I find that I'm driven by my habits, by my passions, by my desires, and then I lose my happiness. On the other hand, when I disengage from my body and withdraw into my idealism of mind and inner condition of well-being, then my mind is clear and I'm not sullied by the passions. I am not confused by the drive of my desires. And so I would want both, but I cannot have both together because somehow one seems to override the other. And we realize that you cannot have a holistic, true holistic well-being or true holistic development for that matter, if there is not something which unifies it and holds all the strings together and makes that the link point through which everything else is held in perfect harmony. Is there such a thing in us? Is this even possible? In fact, what happens in normal life is we try to impose this unification through the intellect, through the mind. The mind tries to seize on the body, on the life energies, on the desires, on our different needs, and somehow force them together, which doesn't work. Often it involves suppressing, repressing, and compelling, and then either some part of the emotions or the body reacts and revolts and shuts down the mind. None of these parts can in themselves be a center around which everything can be organized, because each of them is a valid center with only a valid role. It does not have the role of unification. There is another part, and I will go straight to the point, our essential spiritual truths, our essential spiritual identity, the soul or self within, which is the origin of all these and the driver for all these. That alone is capable, therefore, of unifying their various needs and guiding them in a manner which is harmonized, because it is something so essential that it is not bound to form. It can deal with all forms, because it is something so originating that it is not dependent on any causality. Therefore, it can seize upon any power, however powerful or however limited, and know it intimately, because it is the underlying reality of everything that exists. Therefore, it is already inherently present in our mind, in our emotions, in our vital energies, in our prana, even in our body, in the very tissue and substance of matter. It is the same one self that is existent, not only within us, but in all things and in all beings. And therefore, this alone, without exception, this alone is capable of unifying all these different powers, functions, levels, and parts of our being. Not only that it can unify all these, but it can also bring the harmony we seek with others. It's not good enough that I have unified integral well-being within me if I'm always in conflict with my friends, or if I'm in conflict with the world, or I find the world is always opposing what I try to do. The same power which unifies us is equally the same self in all beings and in the whole universe. And therefore, it can actually bring about the influence and offers the means by which we can be in harmony with the whole world, at least potentially. But we cannot be in harmony with the whole world if we are not first in harmony with ourselves. So we first recognize this very important principle, that you cannot exercise a power, a quality, a freedom, a faculty in the world unless you have it first within you and within your own power of freedom. Liberated, organized, integrated within you. If you do not have that, you cannot exercise it elsewhere. And that's why Sri Krishna observes that you have to first become Swarat, master of yourself, before you can be Samrat, that is master of the universe. And so the self, or the soul as the individualized self within us, is the fulcrum around which this integral well-being is possible. Now, what is the means by which we will be able to do this? And here we come to the theme of our conference, which is yoga. Yoga is to unite with the self, with the truth that we are, with our deepest and highest potential, with the divine. Each of these is the same thing stated in a different way with a different emphasis. Yoga is the means. But what is yoga? And here we come to another big problem. If you ask 10 different people, what does yoga mean to you? You will get 10 different answers. If you go to 10 different teachers, you will get 10 different methods or approaches or even practices. Often people will say, okay, I want to do meditation. What shall I do? And depending on who you ask, you'll get a completely different answer. You could even ask, what do you want to meditate for? And based on that, you would get a different answer within the same system, within the same school, or from the same teacher. Yoga similarly is like this. You will get different answers. And why is that? Because, and this is a very important truth, yoga itself is a diverse, richly developed, even I will say perfected science and technology. And this is the case even with modern physical science and technology. When it was in its early stages of development, it was very simple. You could put all the knowledge in a single book. Today, when science has matured and the technology is growing towards perfection, it has got so specialized and so diversified that you have to talk to specialists. You can be a physicist, or you can be a cosmologist, or you can be a biologist, or you can be a mineralogist, or you can be anything. And each of these specializations is as if trying to look at the whole from a narrow, limited angle. There's a famous statement that a specialist is one who knows more and more about less and less. And because of the nature of reality, because reality, the self, is infinite. Not only infinite in space, not only infinite in time, infinite in potential, infinite in its self-unfoldment. Therefore, nothing is ever repeated in the universe. Each wave is unique, each atom is unique, never to be repeated in each moment in the whole universe. But this uniqueness makes it that you can actually zoom into a tiny part and discover infinity. Within the infinitesimal, you can find infinity. And so the problem of science, the more you specialize, the more you discover the entire universe within your specialization, but also the more you may lose context of the whole. And something similar can happen with yoga. In yoga itself, there are specialized broad, let's say, schools or traditions or branches or practices, and within those finer and finer variations and specializations until you can pick one which seems to contradict another. And that's why if you wish to have an integral well-being based on a spiritual foundation, you have to approach yoga not in terms of its specializations, but in terms of its integrality. And so this is going to be the direction of our further discussion. What is this integral perspective of yoga, or an integral practice of yoga? And how are we to approach yoga in an integral way? You look at the yoga traditions today. Of course, all of them trace back to the rishis, and they trace back all the way to the Vedas. But what is described in the Vedas, sometimes in an essential form, has then been caught as a truth, a principle, and then developed over a few thousand years. Sometimes by specialized lineages or schools. And then they develop and perfect something, while someone else develops another line and perfects. And then one day these two meet, and they unify, and then break apart, and rejoin. And there's a complex process by which the whole knowledge has been as if led, guided, developed, tested, and perfected. And that's why it's such a complex scene. You see, you look at a big tree and you see all the branches interwoven, you do not see the roots. That's why you have to go back to the roots to be able to fully appreciate what this is. So let's look at what is at the root of every specialized system. What does a specialized system base itself on? And we can broadly categorize all the different traditions of yoga into broadly 6 specializations of approach. Although the yoga goal is same, the approaches have different starting points. And I will sequence them in a certain way. First being the most material, that which starts with the body, is Hatha Yoga. Basing itself on the body, it builds, uses the lever of the body control that we have. Now, if you take a child and tell him, why don't you sit down and silence your mind? The fellow will say, I'm sorry, I don't know how to stop my mind. But if I say, can you sit down and relax your body? Yes, I can, because I can control my body. And so Hatha Yoga takes the easiest starting point, which is the most material part of us that we can control. And through a series of asanas and pranayama exercises, it establishes the base of stillness, through which the consciousness of the body is opened to the life force. The life force through pranayama is drawn in and amplified and controlled until it is mastered. And then, in the mastery of the life force, you turn to the very foundation of our individuality in the Kundalini. Awakening the Kundalini, it rises to unite our individuality with the transcendent divinity. And you as an individual is linked through the universal to the transcendence. And this is the effective result of yoga, union with the divine, by a means which primarily rests on the body and life energies, prana. And these two are deeply, intimately connected. So Hatha Yoga takes as starting point the leverage of the body and life force in the body. In contrast, and let's complete this idea, what it seeks to do though is develop the full body's potential, the full potential of the prana, and liberate it completely from all its limitations, perfecting the potential which exists within us. But it cannot, or rather in doing so, it overwhelms everything else in your life that you don't have time for anything else. Even at some point in the very advanced stages of Hatha Yoga, the body becomes so vulnerable even to external circumstances. You have to live in isolation, in a purity, simply to be able to maintain the focus of the work you're doing. And so there is a parallel or complementary system, which is the approach of Raja Yoga. Raja Yoga starts with the lever of the mind. It says, look, you have a body. Yes, you can control your body, but who are you really? Who is controlling the body? It's you, the mind. You are Manomaya first. You are mind first. And by mastering yourself as mind, you can open and realize the origin, the self, through the mind as your primary means of concentration. And it draws a little bit from the Hatha Yoga tradition, enough of asana, pranayam, and then you have the Ashta Anga processes, which lead eventually to the samadhi, immersion in the divine. I need not go into the details. You're all familiar with this because this is often the basis of the classical yoga that we are taught. But in the process, you realize what it seeks to do is develop a complete mastery of the mental being. And you can see how Hatha Yoga and Raja Yoga are actually complementary systems. While one aims at mastery of the physical body and the pranic body, Annamaya and Pranamaya, the other aims at the mastery of the Manomaya, drawing upon the Annamaya and Pranamaya to the extent needed as required for that. But both demand a total dedication, and your entire life has to be suffused with this practice. Otherwise, you do not attain really to that realization. In contrast to these two, which are complementary, there are three other specialized paths which are not as demanding. Because these two demand so much that you cannot live a normal life. You cannot be in your day-to-day things. You have to stop so many things in order to be able to practice these. But there are three paths which can be lived in your daily life without changing anything. And these three are particularly developed by Sri Krishna in the Bhagavad Gita, and we know them as the Karma Yoga, Jnana Yoga, and the Bhakti Yoga. And I'm going to put them in this sequence for a reason. So Karma Yoga is uses as starting point, or let's say all three use as starting point a drive of impulse within us, which is so deep-rooted that you can never escape it. Notice how even before you're born, you watch a fetus in the womb, you will find these three impulses in it. The fetus will try to act, to move, in response to certain external stimuli. It hears a voice, it responds. It has a desire to try to reach out, and it has a will to try to know. And so you have these Ichha Shakti, Jnana Shakti, Kriya Shakti, and as is celebrated in the tradition, all these three impulses are coming from the one Shakti who is seated within us. But these three are our driving motivations. These three we cannot avoid. They're the drivers of our life. So can we take these three impulses and turn them towards the divine and thereby attain to the yoga? So Karma Yoga takes the Kriya Shakti, the will to action, which is everywhere in all of us. If you were tied up and held, you wouldn't survive for more than a few minutes. You would need to do something. Even if you don't do it externally, you would do internally. Even if you don't do internally, there's always something happening within you that is doing. So doing is your first means and the most unavoidable. And you turn that to the divine. And the process you're familiar with, I will only summarize in their essence, that you first consecrate the object of your efforts, the goal that you seek, and that is easy to give up because it's never in your control. So you give up the fruits of your efforts. As a result, your mind and heart and actions turn to the source and the goal of your efforts, which is the divine. And through that contact, there is an infusion of that influence within, which is purifying your impulse of will itself. And thereby you can begin then to experience the joy in the consecration and make an offering of the effort itself. And eventually you realize it is the divine will working through you which does all the work. You are only the nimitta, the occasion. And at that point, you are at best a servant who is happy to give himself now as the point of focus for the divine will to act. And thereby the ego joins with the divine. And so Karma Yoga uses our activity of life. Which activity? All, without exception, potentially. So it means you don't have to change anything in your life. You do exactly what you're doing. You're running your business, you're meeting friends, you're going to a party, you're doing anything you want to do. But you turn now the effort through the process of the Karma Yoga to the divine. As a result, many of your impulsions will change, your interests will change, which is fine also. But nothing in your life needs to change in terms of its outer forms. You can be doing exactly the same work and still be a Karma Yogi and attain to the realization of the divine. But it's not as comprehensive as the Hatha or Raja Yoga, which aims at the perfection of your whole nature. Equally, the Jnana Yoga takes as starting point the will to know. And there are some of us who are more action-oriented, there are some who are knowledge-oriented, some who are devotion-oriented. So it's a good starting point for us. When the will to know then turns to try to understand, why is it this way? Why is the world like this? What is happening behind the scenes? You're trying to know the truth behind appearances. That's what science does really. It's peeling off layers of reality to try to go to the ultimate source behind everything, isn't it? So Jnana Yoga takes that same impulse, but in a subjective as well as objective way. What behind the appearances is the reality? And one of the indicators of the reality is its permanence. What behind the appearances is permanent while there is a transitory wave on the surface. While the wave rises and falls, you see the flow of the water, which is permanent. Or you see the depths of the ocean, which is permanent. And so on, by dwelling on that which is permanent, that which is true behind, your mind in knowledge turns to the divine. In the process, you begin to perceive the divine. As a result of the perception of the divine, your heart opens with gratitude, with devotion, and with love. And your actions spontaneously offer themselves to the divine because you realize all comes from that and all goes back to that. And you cannot but be a Karma Yogi and a Bhakta as a result of the Jnana. And it leads eventually to the immersion with the divine in a totality of the knowledge as the gateway to the divine. And look at this again. You can practice this without changing anything of your life, with exactly what you're doing today. But in everything you do, that aspect of the perception of the underlying reality behind and the divine working behind the scenes now begins to grow and becomes your driver to union eventually. And then comes the third approach, which is the Bhakti Yoga. In the yoga of the Bhakta, what happens? You perceive the divine through the heart's love. And with the love of the heart, spontaneously there's a movement of self-giving. And the result and culmination of self-giving is union in self-giving. And it is the most beautiful, the most blissful, and the most deeply satisfying of the three paths. Although each has its own natural starting point according to your nature, eventually all three merge. When the heart opens, one begins to perceive the beloved in everything, through everything. You realize how in the little things the divine is helping you constantly. And the things which happen, which you thought were errors or problems, you see and feel the hand of the divine beloved working through those to help you to grow. And carrying you through from within you, even as from outside you there is a pressure, from within you there is a help. And so the gratitude grows, the love grows in a complete self-giving. With it, the perception and knowledge of the divine working is seen, and all our actions are spontaneously given. And so the paths of Jnana and Karma join with Bhakti. You can start with any one of these three, and you'll find the other two join. And this is the form of practice that Sri Krishna teaches in the Bhagavad Gita. There are those who have tried to interpret the Bhagavad Gita as saying this is superior and that is superior and read their system into it. No, Sri Krishna shows you the merging of all three in one single triple path. And the benefit of the triple path, although it's triple, is in the merging of the triple, there is a total integration of these three parts of our being: the mind and its impulse of knowledge, the heart and its impulse of love, and the body and its impulse of will to action. All three merge. And of course, there's a question about the japa. These are parts of japa, and the practice of the sacred name or the name of the beloved are really sub-specializations of these specialized systems. It is not in itself a separate system. It could be through bhakti or through jnana or even through karma that you could use the japa. So the practice in its form is not important, but the intention behind and the objective behind is what leads to the result. So we have the triple path now. We have seen broadly the approach of Hatha Yoga, Raja Yoga, Karma, Jnana, Bhakti as a triple path. And in all these, we are the doer. These are what Sri Aurobindo points out, the Vedantic approach of yoga, where you as the doer have to make the effort. The problem with that is that I am incapable. I am barely able to hold my attention long enough to be able to make an effort. And then my effort flags, my enthusiasm flags, my willpower is weak, my persistence and commitment is shallow and undeveloped, my power of concentration is so weak. How much can you do? And that's why one has the sense, and often in some of these traditions that sense is celebrated, it takes a very long time. It will take lives, years, thousands of lives, thousands of years, etc. Of course, in the Bhakti Yoga, a hidden key is also given to us. I'll share this as a beautiful story. You know, Narada comes down to earth, and as the mediator from the Lord and the divine singer, he reveals and helps us grow to the divine. So he goes to a great Jnana Yogi, and or a Hatha Yogi, let's say, and he's practicing intense, strenuous efforts. And the yogi asks Narada, when will I reach the Lord? And the yogi says, well, for you, it's going to take another 10 lives. And the fellow says, my God, I've struggled so much, suffered so much for the last 40 years, and you're saying another 10 lives. This is too much. I can't manage. This is beyond my capacity. I'm ready to give up. Narada goes now to a bhakta. And the bhakta is singing the name of God. And he is happy, full of joy and love as he sings. And he sees Narada and says, my Lord, when will I reach the divine? And Narada says, you are a great bhakta, but for you it's going to take 1,000 lives. And the bhakta starts singing, exclaiming with love, oh, I will reach my Lord in 1,000 lives. I will reach my Lord in 1,000 lives. And in that moment of ecstasy, he unites with the divine. The message of the story is that it is not the distance perceived in the way, but the way you relate to the divine which makes for the distance. Not the way, but the relationship you set which makes the difference. And that is why it is extremely important to know the divine not as someone far away, but as someone intimately close to us, always within us, always us in our essence. And in that closeness, you will find the yoga becomes so much more rapid and the nature of the effort less strenuous. But the key is given here in this little beautiful story. Of course, it is used to justify that the way of the bhakta is superior, but we don't get into that discussion now. But the point being, in all these systems which we have looked at, the 5 systems, you are the one making the effort. But there is a different way, and the clue is given in the story. And that different way is that the Lord himself is reaching out to you when you make an effort to reach him, isn't it? When you reach out to grow and to realize the divine is not sitting impassively out there somewhere, as you see in the many of the Abrahamic traditions, where God creates the world and sits back and watches and requires you to follow rules, otherwise you get punished or whatever. He is not separate. He is one with the world. He is in the world. That's why we have the picture of Shiva as Neelakantha. He takes the pain and suffering of the world upon himself to support the world and sustain from within. When you suffer, it is he within you that suffers. Shri Krishna says in the Bhagavad Gita, when you torture the body, you torture me who is within you. Even in the body, not just as soul, but as the divine presence which is immanent everywhere in the universe. And so we come to a very important idea. Your effort is not in isolation, it is simultaneously accompanied by the divine reaching out to help you equally. The problem, though, is that you are too fixated on your effort and you are not ready or able to take his help because you start with the idea that the divine is far away. And now we come to a sixth system which reverses this relationship. The sixth system is the path of Tantra. And I'm speaking of Tantra as it is in the original tradition, not as it is taught in the West, where it is confused with the Kama Sutra. Nothing to do with that. Tantra is a fundamental approach of conscious self-surrender to the divine. But the divine not in his transcendence, but the divine in immanence and the Shakti of the divine, who is the power that manifests the divine. I'm going to make this distinction a little, I'll elaborate a little on this distinction because it's very important for us to understand the actual nature of the practice, which we will conclude with. You see, in the very beautiful narration of this exists in Kashmir Shaivism, but it is there equally in the Veda. But this story I find very beautiful. In Kashmir Shaivism, it is taught like this. When the divine chooses in his bliss to manifest himself, it is the origin of the manifestation is the Ananda, of the Sat Chit Ananda. The Ananda, as he dwells upon the Ananda with his Chit, and the Chit Shakti, that is the consciousness and power of consciousness that he dwells upon, he moves as if to manifest himself, to burst out in his bliss. But at the moment where he would burst out into multiplicity, he pauses. Because if he were to burst out, then what would be left to hold it together? So as he pauses, his consciousness and power of consciousness surge out and go beyond bursting out the bliss and manifesting the bliss. And you see at that point the division of two. There is the divine as consciousness, the Sat, which is Chit, which is Ananda. And then there is the movement of the Chit and the Chit Shakti, which is also Ananda, which manifests the Sat and becomes the universe. You see, modern science comes to this very beautiful perception that the whole matter and all universe that we can see materially only, it stops with matter, is energy. So, Annamaya, matter, is energy, prana, but actually, essentially, Shakti. All is Shakti. So, matter is energy, E equals mc square. We are familiar with that idea, but it stops short there. The yoga takes you one step further behind. Energy or Shakti is conscious energy, Chit Shakti. She is a conscious power. And as she pours out to become the whole universe, every single thing in the universe is formed out of her energy, driven by her energy, and led by her drive with her intelligence. Which intelligence? That which is the same intelligence of the divine, which conceived of the whole universe before it burst out as the universe. So the same creative power which is originating is functioning now in the tiniest detail of every single atom and molecule and cell and body and form and tree and stone and human being. There's a very beautiful formulation that Sri Aurobindo has. In one of his poems, he writes, "In the strength of a man, in the beauty of a woman, in the laugh of a boy, in the blush of a girl, the hand that sent Jupiter spinning through heaven spends all its cunning to fashion a curl." So the same intelligence which is bursting out entire galaxies is working inside a single curl, a single cell. Sri Aurobindo points out the divine pours as much in building a shell, which you find on the beach or a grain of sand, as it pours to build an entire galaxy. Why? Because from the perspective of the divine, all is equally a manifestation of the infinite. Finiteness is only an appearance. It is the aspect of the Maya part, of the measuring power, the creative power, measuring out finiteness as an appearance of what is essentially infinite. I'm going to share this as an interesting example just to convince you of this truth. You see, when you look at a paper piece like this, you will say this is finite, this length is finite, this is shorter, this is longer, isn't it? Very simple. Now let's look at it in a more deeper perspective. Between these two ends of the long end, how many points can you count? So yes, there is a half, and there is half of half, and there's half of half of half. And between any 2 points, you'll find another half. How many times? Ultimately, you'll find an infinity of points. In fact, and you're seeing this now with your eyes, with your mind, there is an infinity of points from this point to the other. This finite length is actually infinite with only a finite appearance. Let's look at the shorter length. Shorter length also, you will say, well, yes, but it must have less. Let's count. We put half and half of half and half of half. Between any 2 points, you will find another half and another half. How many? An infinity of points, isn't it? Although this is shorter, this is also infinite. Although that is longer, that is also infinite. But we will say maybe that infinite is more than this. Let's do one more check. Draw a line diagonal from this corner to the other. And draw parallel lines. For every single point on the long edge, there is a unique point on the short edge. For every single point on the short edge, there is a unique point on the long edge. The infinite of the long is exactly identical with the infinite of the short. Can you see that? Your mind bursts. When you see it, you see through the appearance, the illusion, the screen of illusoriness of the finite appearances, and you see the infinity behind. This is the way the divine sees all. All is himself entirely presented as an entire universe within the universe. In the Veda, it is in the Isha Upanishad, you will see that Ishavasyamidam Sarvam. All this is for the habitation of the Lord. Yat kincha jagatyam jagat. Within the jagat, the movement which gives birth to form. That is jagat. Ja is born, gati is speed. By movement, it forms and gives birth. And each unit is a universe inside the whole universe. And so this is the perspective of the divine, and the divine pours entirely in each tiniest piece, including each cell and atom of your body, including each one of us. Who is that who pours? The divine energy, the Chit Shakti, the creative power, who is, remember, not only utterly conscious with all the knowledge, the totality of the knowledge, the omniscience, but the omnipotence, the all power, and the omnipresence. She is everywhere because there's nothing which exists which is not herself, because all is an expression of her. And we will also say the blissfulness of the Ananda. She is everywhere blissfully. Now, when we look at the universe in this way, it changes the relationship of the yoga completely. Who is doing the yoga? Did you ever consciously think yourself to develop your intelligence? Did you ever consciously give birth to yourself to create a body? Do you actually feed the cells of your body and make them grow? No, who does it? We'll say, that's nature. But what is nature? What is this Prakriti? It is the working of the same creative energy that we have called Chit Shakti, but now operating in matter, which is almost somnambulistic and unconscious and mechanical in appearance. But behind that is the full power of her intelligence working through these. And whenever she chooses, she can intervene to change things, and we call that a miracle. But no, it is a free exercise of her free will, who is always free, because all in the universe is only her will playing out. There is no other will. So everything is a play and exercise of the divine delight expressed in freedom. The appearance of compulsion is only a rhythm of repetition or habit, and especially in the domain of the denseness of matter, we experience the habit of the working of that energy. And so in the momentum of the habit of repetition, we see a pattern and we call it a law. The science tells you that these are laws of physics. Who created the laws? Who maintains the laws? Who ensures they are not broken? Science doesn't answer those questions. But from the yoga perspective, we will say they are not laws, they are habits of the free operation of the divine creative energy. Shakti, the divine mother, she is conscious. And where is she? Not far away in the transcendence, but here in the immanence. Where is she within you? She is in your brain as the intelligence. She is in your heart as the love. She's in your body as the life energy and even the substance of your matter. She is everywhere. And it is she who has led the journey of your evolution and brought you to this point of awakening. And when one day you wake up and say, oh my God, I have been wasting my life. I need to realize something more precious and more true. It is she within you who is awakening that to you. In the Bhakti tradition, there's a very beautiful way of looking at it. They say, you do not remember the divine until the divine thinks of you. Now, it's a way of saying it. But the idea being, when the divine moves within you to awaken, you experience the awakening. You never woke yourself up. You couldn't, isn't it? This recognition is at the root of the whole approach of the Tantra. What does Tantra do? It says, well, to say that I'm making the effort, that I can do the effort is stupid, is foolish, is a delusion. All effort is her action within me. But because I think myself separate, I have my ego, I have my habits, and I'm rooted in the mechanism of my habits, while she works on me and shapes me, I am resisting at each step. Therefore, the journey of growth, evolution, and of yoga is slow, laborious, and painful. Therefore, it requires me to make an effort at each step, because otherwise I'm resisting. And even when I make an effort, I'm resisting to do more than my effort, because I cannot do more than my effort, right? So Tantra as an approach cuts through all this and says, she is the one doing it. And if I place myself entirely in her hands, she will do in me, in a trice, in an instant, that which I can never do. The power which creates the universe is working in me to act and make me perfect, which I could never have achieved on my own. And so the principle of the Tantra approach is conscious self-surrender to the Divine Mother, Divine Shakti, who is here already within us. But how do you do that? And what does it mean, conscious self-surrender? Well, to the extent that you put yourself in her hands, she takes you and lifts you and changes and transforms you. The problem is I can't put myself entirely in her hands because I don't even know myself. That's where the element of the conscious effort of yoga comes. Now, what we see is these 5 systems that we spoke of as the Vedantic approach are complementary to the Tantra. Both are necessary. An element of personal effort is required to be able to offer yourself to the Divine Mother. But to the extent that you offer yourself to her, she fills your effort and amplifies the result of your effort. You can see how these two are complementary. The Vedantic approaches prepare and make possible the self-surrender. The self-surrender then turns and fills with the action of the Shakti our effort and amplifies the result. And the two working together, merging into each other, lead to through the most rapid means to the yoga. And so this is now the integral perspective of the practice of yoga. We see here all the specialized systems have served to develop a technology and perfect it to such a degree that every individual in the world, with whatever the uniqueness of Swabhava and Swadharma, will find in the body of yoga the natural approach, which is for them the most effective. There's a question someone asks, how can you know my Swabhava and choose my particular approach of yoga? The answer is very simple. That which is for you the most spontaneous way is your starting point, but it's not your only way. You may start with karma or bhakti or jnana or hatha or raja, whatever is for you the most attractive and the most natural in the impulse of your nature and of your seeking. But as you grow, you will naturally open out to the perfection of all these different working together, including the principle of self-surrender of the Tantra. And all these working together will make for an integral practice of yoga, leading to an integral realization of the divine equally through the path which is the most rapid and the most complete. I'll take a pause here to convey a very important idea. In the paths which have sought an exclusive ascetic realization, which have said the world is illusion and only God is true, they have ignored this aspect of the power of Shakti. the creative power of the divine, which is the world itself, and the bliss of the divine, which is in the world. They've cut that out as an illusion and focused only on the divine in transcendence, beyond space and time. The result is everything within you, and including the power of the Shakti, is an enemy. You have to fight against every impulse, natural impulse within you, to cut, suppress, and kill until you withdraw into transcendence. That's the strenuous path. But the moment you realize that the same divine is present here, embracing you and working around you and within you at every moment to help you, you open and give yourself, and then every single activity, every single experience, every single situation of your life is only a finger of the divine, or the divine fills that action to lift and grow and lead you to your yoga. Everything is there to help you. Nothing can oppose you. Even the Asura coming to attack you, you discover behind the energy of the Asura the same origin of the divine Shakti, who now works through the Asura's negative intention to give you the positive result. You see, so the recognition of this truth changes the whole understanding of yoga. All the systems and the specialized systems of yoga now are recognized for the body of knowledge and the technology that they offer, but we will not stop with a specialized system. We will look at its place in our larger integral practice of the yoga, the one large body of yoga of which these are specialized limbs and branches of knowledge and approach and technology. We will look at the whole of ourselves as well as the whole of the practice. Everything within us is to be taken up, nothing to be rejected. What is rejected is distorted movements of our different parts. But every part is taken. Egoistic tendencies, petty jealousies, and angers we reject. But the part which feels angry or which feels the ego is the part which needs now to be opened and given to the divine. Now, in this context, we will bring back consciously the principle of surrender and join it with the other 5 systems of which are Vedantic in their approach. Whatever may be your way, whether your starting point is Hatha or Raja or Bhakti or Karma or Jnana, bring into it the conscious principle of surrender. If your starting point is the Hatha Yoga practice of asanas and pranayam, well, work to awaken the body consciousness, not just to stretch your limbs, but awaken the consciousness, and in the consciousness of your limbs, feel the giving of yourself to the divine Shakti who is right here, immanent within you. And as you move to give to her, there is the filling that you will experience of a deep peace, or a light, or a clarity, or a purifying energy, which will fill you in the very act of your giving. And with it also her special quality of the divine Ananda, which is very different from sensations or pleasures. And as that begins to fill and lift your whole being, you will find through that very simple practice, there is an upward turn, and with it, the ripple effect on all the other parts. Your bhakti will awaken, your jnana aspect will awaken, and all the rest spontaneously. Whatever your starting point, recall and remember the full perspective and bring the principle of self-surrender to the Divine Mother, to the Divine Shakti. We are all formed by her out of her own body, even as the universe is formed by her out of her own body, isn't it? And that's why our natural relationship with her is of feeling ourselves a child of the Divine Mother. And I'll conclude by relating this whole perspective to the Vedic perspective. In the Veda, this was the broad approach, but they saw the working of the cosmic powers as children of the Divine Mother of the Aditi, as conscious powers operating in the cosmos as the gods. But also within us, the same powers are operating, and they are our psychological powers. Who leads them? She, behind the scenes. And this is what you see the truth in the Kena Upanishad. When the gods say, we have conquered, well, she appears and they cannot recognize her. And she reveals that it is her energy, or rather, she leads to the divine who works through them. And so the idea that within us, all these powers, which are the basis for the specialized systems, are integrated by her presence. And where is she within us? The easiest way by which you can recognize her in you is the love in which you feel yourself a child of the divine, or of the Divine Mother. Or for some of us, it is in the turn in joy in the mind to the divine knowledge that works behind. Or for us, some of us, it is in the consecration of all we do to her as the divine Shakti, as the goddess and the mother and the divine Lord to whom she takes us, and so on. Whatever the specific form of your practice, if you keep the integral perspective of yoga, you will find it will take you to an integral approach in the yoga practice itself and lead to an integral well-being, which is obviously the realization and the immersion in the divine, not only in soul, but also in nature. Not only perfection in liberation of the consciousness in the divine, but also perfection in the awakening in our limited mind, that divine knowledge. In our limited life energies, that divine power. And in our very limited and dull and resistant material body, that divine beauty and perfection, which she already has and is working inside us to organize. And as she moves to organize it, we grow and we call it evolution. But she already has what we are seeking. And so the more we are able to give ourselves more integrally in our surrender, the more she is able to form these in us integrally. So this is the broad picture I will place before you. And in the form in which Sri Aurobindo articulates this, the motto or the key word, key phrase that he offers is, all life is yoga. Because everything in life was the unconscious yoga of nature. And as we awaken and consciously participate, the same things now we take up, amplify, intensify, and speed up. And it becomes now the conscious yoga, which leads us to the divine perfection, the divine consciousness of knowledge, the divine power, and the divine bliss, and the living in the eternity and infinity of the divine consciousness in the complete freedom as an active focal point of divine action in the world. This is the perfection that is sought, both in the systems of Tantra as well as in the Vedic approaches, the knowledge of which was largely forgotten in the ascetic phase when the withdrawal of life became the only goal. So this is where I will pause and look at some of the questions. There's a question here about the role, the system of Tantra as spoken in Buddhism. You see, Buddhism came at a time when already there had been a turn away from life. The warning that life can trap you if you lose yourself had to be corrected with a withdrawal from life as if to get a realization of the divine beyond life. And so the ascetic phase had already come in by that time. And so the Buddha was seeking not the perfection of life, but the solution, the shortest solution to the suffering in the world. And he didn't look for a long solution. He was looking for the shortest solution. And that was, of course, in the realization of the transcendence. And again, within the Buddhism, there are two branches, those which seek transcendence beyond life and killing of the mind, or those who seek the transcendence in life, implying a perfection of life, but not always explicit, as in certain Buddhist practices. So always there are these branches which will appear because any exaggerated one-sidedness tends to be corrected. But the specific idea that life itself is an expression of the divine was lost in the ascetic phase. And so it is often lost in many of these systems, including in the later Vedantic practices, and particularly the knowledge of the Divine Mother. And she, as the Shakti who leads us, was lost. It was awakened in the Tantric system, but again lost. And so this is the principle we have to bring back in our practice. There's a question which is, under what conditions the divine inside of you can wake you up? Well, the divine can wake you up at any point. The problem with that is the awakening would be too shocking. There are actually people who have had spontaneously a spiritual experience and they experienced fear, or they thought that they were losing their mind. The problem is you are not yet ready for the awakening, and therefore the push from within destabilizes your nature or your personality. And that's why there's a long phase of an evolutionary development in which there's a slow push from within for slow steps of development. But once we are sufficiently individualized, sufficiently organized as a thinking conscious being, Manomaya, as is celebrated as one of the stages in the development in the Vedic yoga, once you become the Manomaya Purusha, you are ready. The ego which was built up by nature so far now has to be broken so that you may rise to something greater. So at that point, the nudge comes from within more strongly. So each person has their own stage of readiness. But as a whole in humanity, we have come to that stage. As a whole, generally speaking. And this is the reason why you see the crisis everywhere. Everywhere in human affairs, we have a crisis in our politics, in our social life, in our religions, in our traditions, in our daily life. Everywhere you're in crisis. And the crisis cannot be solved by the consciousness which created it, which is the intellect. And so we are as if pushed from within and pulled from above to help us break through, to rise from the intellectual consciousness to a still higher and intuitive knowledge and towards the self, the consciousness of the self. So under what conditions can the divine inside of you wake you up? When you ask and you give yourself, then the action can be most effective, most rapid with the least damage. Otherwise, if you press too hard a rigid ball, it will crack. When the ball gives itself and says, take me, then it can be taken up and easily changed. That's why our precondition of readiness is conscious aspiration and conscious self-surrender. If in between you can add one more point of consciously purifying yourself by removing the things which contradict your aspiration. So three things. First, an aspiration, and you will see this in the Vedic yoga as the focal point of the whole Vedic approach is Agni, which is the flame of aspiration within us. Literally, it is the divine impulse, the divine will emerging from deep within you, from your soul, from yourself, pushing out and nudging through the Ichha Shakti, Jnana Shakti, and Kriya Shakti. But when you become conscious, it is no more a smoky flame. It becomes a conscious light. The fact that you're conscious of a spiritual aspiration within you is your first step. Second step, you change your life to align it to your aspiration. Remove things which contradict it. You find there are certain activities or certain states which cloud your aspiration. Well, you now set those aside. And third, consciously give yourself to the divine. You conceive of the divine with the mind, or feel your love for the divine, or consecrate your life to the divine, or all three. And in this movement of self-giving and opening, the third movement lifts, and immediately one experiences the response of the divine Shakti, who is always here. She knows you more intimately than you. You may say, does the divine know when I'm calling? She is the intelligence within you that is experiencing the call, isn't it? So she cannot but be responding instantly, not from far away, not from a million miles. Instantly inside you, there is the response. You give, open yourself and give in love, and you feel immediately the joy, the peace, the freedom, and even the knowledge. You can ask her for knowledge, ask her for strength, ask her for the love, even ask for the self-giving. But in the very act of that asking, you open yourself and the change begins. There's a question, is it possible to choose and work on more than one path simultaneously? Yes, that's the whole point I'm making. An integral practice is what is needed today. You can take a specialized path as a starting point, but because it is specialized, it will always have a limited result. And at some point you will hit barriers, or there will be parts on you which will have to be set aside or suppressed or rejected. Instead, you keep the broad integral perspectives, begin with that which is most natural to you, but open out to the full branching. The point Sri Aurobindo makes is, if you take a path in itself, often you cannot practice this because the path may be too demanding and you cannot have a second path which is contradicting. But if you go to the essential principle of all the paths, they're not contradictory, they're complementary. Hatha Yoga teaches you to work through the body and to awaken through the body consciousness, the Kundalini. Raja Yoga starts with the mind, and through the mind's purification, there is the awakening of the Kundalini. Bhakti Karma Yoga turns the three impulses to the divine, and Tantra brings the self-surrender as the principle. None of these are contradictory, all are complementary. Put all these simultaneously together, as the base of your effort, starting with that which is easiest. So what is moksha and can it be achieved by yoga? Yes, that is the whole goal of yoga. But what is meant by moksha is very important. Because in the ascetic phase of life, we have looked at moksha as a liberation outside in the transcendence, outside the universe, outside space and time. But the true nature of the moksha is the realization of the divine freedom here in life. Because the divine is free here. The divine is not free outside only, and you can't say the divine is bound in matter. The divine is equally free in matter. Even though matter is an expression of the divine in the essence in the matter is free. So for us to be in the totality of the divine is to be not only simultaneously present in the transcendence beyond space and time, but equally present in space and time at the same time, as the divine is equally embracing his space and time, and equally active in matter in the body, because the divine is equally in the material world, not just in the higher worlds. So the whole point of evolution was, the whole point of entering in birth in matter was to bring that essence of the divinity into matter and awaken in matter and realize in matter the Satchidananda. And so the Vedic rishis exclaim, we are children of immortality. Amritasya putra. What is Amritam? That's Satchidananda. We are children of Satchidananda. And therefore the realization of Satchidananda here in life is the whole point of our entry into matter. So, so the one important question, what is the difference between inaction and self-surrender? Does self-surrender mean that you don't need to do anything? No, that's the wrong surrender. That is the passive surrender of the tamasic action. So when you have to eat food, do you say, I will sit back and the food will be put into my mouth by the divine? Well, in a way, when you're lifting and putting it, is the divine energy working in you that is feeding you, right? Who is digesting it? Well, it is the divine energy digesting you. Who is growing the food from the ground? The divine energy. And yet you have to participate in the divine play. The food is shown to you, the intelligence given to you to act, to lift, to cook, to prepare, and to feed yourself. Or to change the diet when you are sick. The intelligence is given. So recognize that the intelligence is also the divine. The impulse to action is the divine, but all of these are clouded in their expression. Your intelligence is clouded, your impulse is clouded by the narrow egoism, which cuts off the freedom of the divine action, cuts you off and separates you. And that's why your initial ego effort is necessary. But as the ego gives itself more and more in the joy, the divine fills and thins the ego and frees it, dissolves it until you join with the universality and transcendence of the divine. You literally experience the world as yourself, or as your own body, or an extension of your body. And this focal point as a focus for the divine action here. There is no I anymore. There's only the joy of this instrument. And so towards that, you start with the ego. Ego is not a problem. Ego is a great help if you can turn it to the divine in service and in consciously giving itself. Ego is a problem when it separates itself and exaggerates its separateness. So yes, you have to surrender, but not through inaction, through action. And the whole point is making you grow in your capacity. The intelligence is given and the strength is given. So practical example in daily life, how we can surrender to Shakti. There is one simple practice you could do. Every day, you dedicate 1 minute or 2 minutes, if you so feel inclined, or more if you like, but 1 minute as a minimum, where you will concentrate, center yourself, gather in your deepest, truest, or highest aspiration, whatever that means for you. It's a state of being, state of awareness, state of aspiration, that you center yourself as much as you can. From there, you turn to the divine mother and the Supreme Lord in whatever way you feel most natural, through the mind, through the heart, through the action, through gesture, through work, doesn't matter what. You turn and feel yourself in relation to her as her child. Feel the bhakti, turn the knowledge, and if you like, ask, communicate, speak, or wordlessly give yourself and be in the joy of that immersion for 1 minute. Now you'll notice a very simple practice. The joy that it will give you will begin to slowly spread into the rest of the day. And then sometimes in the middle of the day, spontaneously you will remember and offer spontaneously. Or at the end of the day, again, you may fix another time when you will do this consciously. Beginning of the day consciously, end of the day consciously. In the middle of the day, whenever inspired or whenever you feel like, oh, I miss my beloved and I remember my beloved. Turn in heart, turn in mind, turn in action. Whatever you're doing, you consecrate. A variation to this, you might extend it into an activity. You may take a more sacred form of a puja where you offer, consecrate, but recognize the puja is only an external symbol of a giving of yourself. Or you may be doing a regular work. You may be cooking food and you treat this as the puja. Treat this as the havan. What you add in the fire is your love, your consecration, your self-giving, or remembering the divine as you do the work, or feeling the bhakti for the divine as you do the work. Whichever way, spend a few minutes in immersion in an activity. So these are all very simple, basic practices of surrender to the divine and to the divine Shakti. And let's look at a few more questions. Why do we need to know about the spiritual way of living consciousness when we can have a simple mindset to lead life in a certain way without disturbing others? This is something I don't have a rational answer for. Nobody compels you to live a spiritual life. Live whatever life gives you the greatest satisfaction, I will use the word, or fulfillment more accurately. And if for somebody, just living my life, doing my chores every day is giving me that deep satisfaction, wonderful. Let them be as they are. But there are those who feel that that is not enough. There are those who have been through that phase and then realize that this is not giving me satisfaction. There is something else which fills this that gives me satisfaction. Now I want that. And that's when we will say you're ready for a deeper satisfaction. So the natural journey of life is from satisfaction to deeper satisfaction to greater satisfaction and fulfillment. There comes a point of transition where you realize all that gives you the deepest fulfillment is rooted in your deepest or highest divine parts. And now we seek to realize the full potential of that. You see, once you've glimpsed the divine bliss, or even a part of it, a tiny drop of it, or once you've glimpsed the divine knowledge, omniscience and omnipotence, and a glimpse of the divine love, even a tiny bit touching you, you'll find nothing else in life will satisfy you except a further deepening and seeking for that. When you've come to that point, that's when you enter a real committed practice of yoga. Before that, you are in the unconscious yoga of nature or are in a preparatory phase for a total dedication of life to yoga. And it doesn't matter where you are. It is not a crime, unconscious yoga of nature. You accept each one for where they are and accept yourself for where you are. And you may realize you have a spiritual interest, but not yet that deeply committed. Fine, enjoy that interest, give yourself to that interest, nourish yourself by it. It will purify you and prepare you for the total immersion. And the result will be that in this very life, we should be able to have at least a first experience of these higher possibilities, which is ourself. We are that bliss. The bliss is us, but hidden now because separate from our surface parts. And it is these surface parts which will turn to realize ourselves to be able to experience that bliss in the world and share it and manifest it in the world. So I think this is all I will cover for now. Vinay Chandra is here.
Yes.
Should we take up any other questions or would you like to close now? So there's a question of social relationships.
Yes,
Maybe I'll just
I think that's the one.
And somebody asking about pleasure. You know, pleasure is a very superficial sensation. The same pleasure you continue long enough, it will become pain. This is not bliss. Bliss is fundamentally a higher poise of consciousness and belongs to a consciousness which is infinite, not divided. Pleasure and pain are contradictory positions of a divided consciousness of duality. So we are speaking of something which belongs properly to the oneness consciousness. But social relationships, yes, are meant also to express the divine play. Each one of us, when we discover the underlying divinity within us, will find we fall spontaneously in harmony, even though we are independent and free. The current problem which you see in society is that everywhere people are trying to organize harmony and unity and equality by structures and systems imposed, which end up either suppressing your freedom or creating an artificial homogeneity against which your individuality rebels. They don't work. The only true harmony and the only true society is a divine harmony in a divine society, for which the foundation is each one of us going back to our deeper spiritual center. And when we begin to act from the full freedom of that spiritual center, we find, because it is the same self, but differently expressed in each one of us, we tend spontaneously to fall into a harmony and a collective harmony. So while our initial effort is an individual harmony and individual well-being, the fulfillment of our yoga is in a collective yoga and a collective well-being and a collective expression of the Satchidananda and the play. And this is the true sense of the Leela. The Leela is not just the way things are happening. Yes, that is also an appearance of Leela, but the underlying Leela is the expression of the bliss of Satchidananda and the delight of the divine in the play through so many divine centers of divine action. And so this would be the true sense of social relationships in the spiritual path. We are far from that. But the first step that we take is recognize each one is a soul in evolution. Nobody is fundamentally bad or totally good. Each one is in a phase of their journey where the divine principle and potential within them is still unfolding through many layers of confusion of their outer nature. And it is in this sense that we have to recognize how we can help each other or work together or travel together in the journey towards a Deva Sangha, a divine community. But at the moment, the foundation will be on our relationship from a soul to another and not limiting ourselves to external forms of relationships. I think we'll conclude with this, reminding that, remember, you are never alone. Every time you make an effort, it is the divine Shakti from above helping you, but from within pushing you equally. You could make the effort because she nudged you, and at the same time from outside, from her universal and cosmic operation, she is there to lift you. You are never alone. Call, ask for help, give yourself to her, develop and deepen your relationship with her of love and self-giving. And the whole journey will be a journey of joy to greater joy. And it will be from ease to greater ease, not a struggle, not a pain. Yoga is not intended to be a painful process. It is meant to be a joyous awakening. We'll end with this. Namaste.
Namaste. Deep gratitude, Shraddha, for what you offered today. I'm at loss of words to describe the value of your whatever you shared with the speakers. In fact, each one of us are highly indebted for what you have offered. And it couldn't have been more timely because we are beginning the session, we are beginning this whole festival and putting into perspective the various yogas that are there, and also giving us this holistic framework, the integral framework, and to find out the unique place of each approach and how they complement each other. I think that was the best part of the session, and this is also a sort of a guideline that we would have for the entire 1 month long festival. And all the sessions are arranged or planned for keeping this idea in mind. So thank you very much once again for this lovely session. Before we end, I would like to announce tomorrow's programs. Srinivas ji, can you please flash the details of tomorrow's sessions quickly once? So tomorrow morning in 7 to 8 a.m. session, we have a practice that is chakra-based traditional Hatha Yoga practice by Yogacharya Rakesh. And in the noon session, that is between 11:30 a.m. to 12:30 p.m., we have Chando Yoga, a unique yoga sadhana for maintaining health and wellness by one of the greatest scholars of our times, Sampadananda Mishra ji, who is the director of Sri Aurobindo Foundation for Indian Culture, Sri Aurobindo Society. And in the evening, we continue with the same idea of the Chandas, the Vedas, and we have another experiential session exploring wellness with Vedic chanting, Srimati Shantala Sriramaya, between 7 p.m. to 8 p.m. in the evening. So I invite you all to join this and stay with us in this month-long journey. And with this, I thank each one of you for having participated in this session. And I also offer my apologies because of the time we couldn't take all your questions. The list of questions went on becoming big at the end. So that only says about how serious you are all participating in this session. So with this, I would like to bring the session to an end, but maybe I'll request Shraddha if you have a last message or a comment or a guideline that you would like to share.
Just simply love the Divine Mother. The culmination of love is union. All the rest comes as a result of that. Namaste.
Thank you.